first, thanks for having me on. Yeah, I think this is the 10th anniversary this year, and as I've said in a number of previous interviews on this, the thing with the Knights of the Old Republic comics is Dark Horse, which had created the Knights of the Old Republic brand back with the Tales of the Jedi. They wanted to do a comic series that played on the Knights of the Old Republic name, and that's what they approached me to write. But basically, they didn't care when it was set relative to the games or whether it adapted the games or was completely separate. Actually, I think it was probably their preference that it was completely separate. And so, famously or infamously, I created a story about, Zane Carrick, this Jedi fugitive. And I later on figured out how it ended with the video games. I was certainly familiar with the video games. Once I started working on the comics, I started trying to play, and I had my nieces and nephews. My niece and nephews had beaten. I think both games were out by that point, 1 and 2, and I knew enough from there was a historical document that was created that was on BioWare's site, sort of the oral history of the galaxy or something like that. It was like a 9-part thing that gave you the history of what had happened in between the last Tales of the Jedi comic book and then what had happened in the events of the game, which is in the 39 50s. And I built from that. I decided, Terrace was the place that I had seen because that's kind of the first place you see in the game. I figured that would be the one place that everybody had seen playing the game, whether they, got through it all or gave up as I had. They would at least have gotten to Terrace. So, I decided to set Zane there. And Lucasfilm is kind of universal in the way it handles things. A game is equivalent to a comic book is equivalent to a novel. So, they were aware of all of the history in the games. They were aware of what happened in the games, and were able to point me to some specific resources. But other than saying, hey, the light side version of the game is the canonical, version, they didn't need to give me too much, other than to say, it'd be a good idea not to depict Revan, what Revan's face looks like or anything like that, because again, it's going to conflict with the game. I decided to put the comics several years before the video game because I didn't want to set it after either game 1 or game 2 because I didn't want to get in the way of what they were planning for game 3. If there had been a game 3, and at the time I don't think anybody knew, I was kind of able to tell a story that would have fit in the Clone Wars in the Knights of the Old Republic era. Here we have the Covenant, Zane's masters. They can see things are going to get rotten pretty soon, but they don't know specifically what. And the player knows enough of the history of the future to know that, things are going to get bad, but they don't know how or whether Zane fits into it. That was kind of my approach with regard to the game starting out.
One of the complaints that I know one of my co-hosts has, which I don't see as rational, because as they said, they had the little thing that connects the Tales of the Jedi, Tales of the Sith comics that Kevin Anderson and so on worked on with the game. And a lot of the complaints I see is that it kind of just tramples that timeline that people love from the 90s and just kind of disregards it. But, in your experience, they and from what I've seen in the game, don't they seem to be really working really hard to make sure both those timelines work at the same time?
Well, I tried to get it together to the extent that I could. In fact, when I was doing the comics, I had Arca Jeth as a significant character. I had flashbacks showing characters in that era, showing that the style of dress had been different. I even referred to the fact that we have a different Republic Senate building because And it's 30 years. You can assume that style and certain things have changed over that time. But really, the video game, the governing, I think, thing with the people who were designing the video game is they wanted it to look like Star Wars. So if anything, you would expect the earlier days to look similar and maybe nicer. The thought, and I've said this several times about the technology being about the same throughout, is that outer space was discovered 5,000 years ago in the Legend timeline. So there really be a whole lot of difference between what stuff looks like 21,000 years before and then Star Wars, 1,000 years after hyperspace. One is 25,000 years. You have to assume that probably technology has plateaued, that you can go faster than light, but that's it. We don't have teleportation. We don't have any of these other things. And so, to me, things still look sort of the same. I mean, you go outside today and people are still driving on pavement the way they were 100 years ago. Certain things are probably not going to evolve too much. And again, stylistically, the early comics, I don't think they had a lot of guidance in terms of what stuff should look like in this early era. I don't think certainly they ever thought that there would be a video game or video of any kind depicting this time period. And so I think they felt freer to give it sort of this archaic look. I'm not sure that in retrospect, if they had it to do over again, they necessarily would go that direction, because it did cause a number of sort of hiccups, particularly as we were dealing with the facts that, as I've talked about with regard to Lost Tribe of the Sith, we were trying to deal with the fact that the Lost Tribe was coming from a time period where the lightsabers didn't even stand alone. They were what we call the curling irons. They had battery packs. They had wires attached to them, and the Sith didn't even have sabers at all. You're not going to do a multi-million-dollar video game and call it Star Wars and have it look like that without having everybody go, "What the heck is going on?" So I think there was probably a commercial aesthetic that needed to be hewed to. Once you did something that was going to be on a much wider scale, like a video game is going to be, as opposed to a comic book. Again, it's a big galaxy. It's not necessarily the case that all of the stuff that we saw on the planets that we saw in the Tales of the Jedi was necessarily representative of what everything else looked like. No two planets in regular Star Wars necessarily look the same. There's different styles and places. So that's a long and roundabout way of answering that question. That's how I rationalized it anyway. During the 5 or 6 years where I was trying to knit the two together, the Tales of the Jedi and the video game version, I tried to split the difference wherever I could.
So, Travis, do you have questions about the KOTOR comics? I know Eric's questions, so we'll get to them a little later on. But do you have questions in this era, Travis?
I do. It's kind of not just that era, though. It's kind of nice we started off with knitting things together, because of this line of comics, my favorite moment within them is that legacy story that gets written called Vector, the crossover between all the ongoing Star Wars books at the time. And I was going to ask what it was like trying to put together the original trilogy and even the legacy storyline with Cade Skywalker, all back up to 4,000 years prior. What was that like working with the different writers and scripters for that?
Well, it was a great idea, and in fact, I think when Randy Stradley, the editor, pitched it to the other authors, his sort of message was prefaced with, the same idea I think was the subject line. He wanted to do the same thing that other publishers were doing with crossovers, and of course, there was no real way to do it with Star Wars, we thought, because we were in different time frames, and there's no time travel in Star Wars. So we had a series of bursts of emails between me and John Ostrander and I think definitely Randy and Jeremy, his assistant editor, and Dave Marshall, who comes in as assistant editor in the middle of that. To try to figure out a way to do this. Early on, someone had suggested let's do something with Sith magic that progresses throughout all time, and I'm not sure who came up with that, but I do know that I came up with the Rakghouls, and that that would be something. I had realized that in the Knights of the Old Republic comics, we had sort of, mentioned the Rakghouls as existing in the Undercity, but the video game really didn't explain a couple of things. It didn't explain why this particular transformation looked so out of the ordinary for Star Wars, because you would see in the game that characters would just, poof, they would turn into these zombies. They would turn into these Rakghouls. And that didn't necessarily seem, natural. We had talked about this being a plague, a biohazard. And I think Randy said, plagues are not really that interesting visually in terms of as a threat. But if we could tie it to a villain somehow, and I realized that probably what we had is this was a Sith magic, and one of the pieces of evidence that I was able to hook onto is in the game. The Sith soldiers on Terrace are the ones that have the I think they, unless I'm misremembering, they're the ones that have the serum, and it's the doctor that sends you to go try to find the serum to reverse the process. And the serum suggested to me that, well, maybe the Sith actually knew something about this to begin with, and so it might actually have been connected to something. That I was able, after multiple, we went through, I did 4 drafts because I was doing the first storyline, and I went through 4 drafts where I wrote an entire, plot for the first storyline, and the first one tied up way too much with what I had been doing in the previous issues with the Mandalorian Wars, and Lord Adaska was in there, and there was going to be this character that was actually going to be Lord Adaska's niece, and that was going to be the character that went through everything, which was Celeste. And what we decided to do instead was each successive draft that I did removed more of my characters from the ongoing series, narrowed it just down to what we finally had, which was Zane and Griff. And then I had the idea to, let's say that the reason that the Covenant was on Terrace to begin with is that they were hunting for this artifact that actually caused the Rakghoul plague, and that their agent, one of their agents, was Celeste, and Celeste goes onto the planet to find this talisman at what happens to be the same time that Zane and Griff are on there alone as a result of the events of what had been going on in the Coder comics at the time. And so what happened at that point, once I wrote that, and this is about a year into the process, Randy said, I think we've got it here. Let's get everybody in a room. And so they flew me and John Ostrander out to Oregon. We sat in the office and figured out, okay, here's how this is going to affect the later stories. Here's who's going to get what scenes in these individual stories. It was an interesting project, an interesting way of tying the different parts of the timeline together. And it ended up having interesting effects on the Knights of the Old Republic comic storyline because we ended up accelerating what was going to happen with Zane and his attempts to clear his name as a response to Vector, because we wanted to show that Vector had really changed things.
That's awesome. Travis, did that answer your question the way you wanted it?
Very much so. That was really fascinating. I appreciate it.
One thing I've noticed when it comes to Star Wars comics, there's people who like every comic. There's people who like the current canon comics, and then there's the Knights of the Republic has its own different beast when it comes to fans of those comics. Has it ever surprised you or caught you off guard just how long-lasting Knights of the Old Republic is in, both as a game franchise but as a comic franchise, even books that came years later? Has it ever caught you off guard just how popular this series is in all its forms?
Well, I think if I had known how popular it was, I might have been more frightened when I started. It is, I knew that the game was good, and I had played it some. Certainly the game continues to be good. I got the game for my mobile device a few years ago, and actually I made it as far as Dantooine this time. So that took a while. But certainly, there's a different feeling to the Knights of the Old Republic comics. There's a lot of humor in this series. It's often black humor, but it's that a lot of that is me trying to recapture what I liked in the early Star Wars comics that I was reading, and the fact that I was able to write the series as long as I did and be the only writer during that time, allowed me to do some things in terms of long-term stories and subplots and hiding a traitor in the cast and that kind of thing. Stuff I had always wanted to do with a big canvas, and it's stuff that I really haven't been able to do again until most recently. With my the Star Trek trilogy that I wrote, the Prey trilogy, which is coming out now, where it's all I wrote it all at once. So it's 1,200 pages of novel, the same way that Knights of the Old Republic was 1,200 pages plus of comics. I was able to you do some misdirections and have some mysteries that were able to boil for a long time. And so I think that's another reason that people, I think cling and like the series, especially now that it's coming out again from Marvel. The first third of the series is already out in book form. The second third of it is coming out in March. That collection where they're actually, for the first time, they're including the handbook that I did. So everything will finally be available, and I think that the series does reward rereading, because you can go back and say, hey, look, here is where they planted this thing that was there, as a surprise 2 years later. I always, like that in comics as a reader, when I realized that the authors had, foreshadowed things way in advance. It made me feel smart for, picking out the clues. And it wasn't just something where, they changed everything or decided things on the fly.
So that gets me to a listener question, since you brought up how, I think it's called Star Wars Legends: The Old Republic Epic Collection, Volume 2 comes out next March. So the listener says, the Old Republic, Knights of the Republic Comics Volume 1 came out several years ago, and the new one's coming out in 2017. Why does it take so long between volumes? Is this typical when it comes to trades, or does it have to do with the rights, say, between Dark Horse and Marvel?
No, it's actually the first one came out July of 2015. This one's March of 2017. The Epic collections are competing with many other Epic collections to come out. So there's this is not something like when Dark Horse was doing them, they had already been reprinting books all along, so there was sort of a calendar for these things to come out. Marvel, has only so many Star Wars related gigantic collections of this 400-page nature that they can get out in a year, and so I don't know whether it's 4 or 6 or whatever it is, but Knights of the Old Republic is competing with. I think the Legacy books are coming out, and there's certainly been all sorts of books in the Clone Wars and movie era that have been coming out, and those as well. It's something like 18 a year to 18 months, and if you think about it, these comics took 18 months to come out when they started. So I think. Personally, I'm in no hurry to have it all out at once. I like the fact that if you are interested in getting to the rest of the story immediately, it's all available digitally. Volumes 2 and 3 break the same way as the volumes that Dark Horse did. So those are out there in comic shops, still in libraries where they're still in print, or not in print, but where they're still available, and on Amazon. So I guess my feeling is, if Marvel just went out and reprinted everything that Dark Horse had, the second that they had the right to do it, that would kind of be a dumping on the market kind of thing of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of comics, not just mine. And there is a production logistics thing involved here, because they are having to take the digital files from Dark Horse. They have to obtain them. They have to resize them for the press. And every printer kind of does things differently in terms of what they do. And again, the guy that's there, that's sort of the librarian that's building these things for Marvel, is going through and making sure that some stuff is added that previously did not appear in the reprints. One of the things, and we did this in the first book, was the in-universe text pages that I did. I did these sort of holo feed pages second year of the series that were in universe. We actually dropped some story points in some of those. Not only are they all appearing, but they're appearing exactly where they fell in between the stories. So I'm really happy with that, and I'm delighted that by the time you get to the third volume, everything I did comics-wise for Knights of the Republic, except for one page, will be available in comics form from Marvel.
So this is a listener question. They said they follow your site, your blog at Fairway Press a lot, and you mentioned some of the trivia things having to do with Knights of the Republic not that long ago. And they just want to know, what was the relationship like between you, the writer, and the artist, I believe it was Brian Ching, when it came to these ones? And you said you wrote them all together, or you wrote the story as you went with 1,200 pages. Was it hard to wait for the art to come in, and what was your reaction when you first started getting the art to these stories that you were envisioning finally put to page and you could finally see the finished result?
Well, Brian was sort of our artist of record in that he did the most, comics. He did the original storyline. He did several of the ones in the second year. And then he came back and he did the last year of the ongoing series. Multiple stories there. And that was really cool that he was able to do that. His designs for the characters were great. One of the things I've talked about is that his design for Jerael didn't look anything like the other Arcanians. But I thought that his design was so great that I ended up making not one, but 3 different plot points out of the fact that, her skin, her eyes, her ears, her fingers, her tattoos, all these things, look completely different from the other Arcanians. And so, that was something where I was able to adapt. Definitely, it was great. Working with him and also working with, Dustin Weaver, I think did the most not just comics issues, but also covers as well. He did after Brian. That was really cool to work with him as well, because he really excelled in doing these big starship set pieces, both on board ships and out in space. The problem that we would always run into is the same problem with any ongoing series, which is that you get into deadline problems, particularly on a book where there's so much detail. In the panels, where everything has to be canonical and everything has to come from somewhere. And so, I would do my best to try to, accommodate some of these things, but every so often something would happen. Famously, issue 9 and 10 ended up having to be reversed because the first Dustin's first storyline wasn't done in time to get all 3 issues 7, 8, and 9 in a row before issue 10 came out. So actually, it's fixed in the graphic novels. We put it in the correct order in the trade paperbacks. But if you got the actual original comics, you saw that the Homecoming story, the Lucian origin story, actually ran as issue 9 and not issue 10. Other things that would happen, in the whole Days Nights year, where it was going to be, 3 issue storyline with Brian, 3 issues with Dustin, 3 issues with Brian, 3 issues with Dustin. Excuse me. The whole idea was that I was going to write arcs that the intention was that the spaceship heavy arcs would be Dustin. Not that Brian didn't do great spaceships, but I just sort of was, playing to what I thought their favorite things to draw were. Whereas, the ones that were more character heavy were going to be Brian's, and it ended up being absolutely the opposite because of the schedules involved, and Dustin doing that first that Days of Fear story arc where we're showing what happens on the planet Serico, and we get to see Zane on the bridge of that big starship that Admiral Karath has. Yeah, I think that's just a beautiful issue. So to the extent that you can, you try to accommodate things, but you often you don't even really know what things are going to look like until the issue comes out.
So last question from me on this before I pass you over to the rest of them. In your blog, you actually mentioned you have a schematic that you provided Brian Ching for one of the towers. How much design input did you have on these comics? Like I haven't talked to a ton of comic book writers. I've talked to a lot of artists. So how much design input does the writer or you as a writer have when it comes to your comics, especially these ones, for at least how things look or how you envision things being laid out?
Well, all these things are suggestions. I mean, the artist can go whatever way they want, but particularly when I'm doing something where, it's a set piece where there may be sort of complicated staging or complicated look to it. It was important to me to know what things look like. And, it was important that I know, well, here's the skylight and here's the elevator and here's where they keep the lightsabers. And it was something where it kind of gets it back to the game roots. I would approach these things like I was doing a role-playing game setting, and I did do some stuff for the Star Wars role-playing game, including the Knights of the Old Republic campaign guide. But I kind of was sketching for myself. Okay, here's what this dungeon looks like. Here's what this setting looks like. And it actually was something where I was able to go back and revisit it again when Zane has to invade the same building when the Mandalorians are in charge of it, in issue 24. It behooved me to know, okay, here's what's on what floor, and that sort of thing. And I think that that stuff can kind of help an artist. They're not obligated to go with it at all.
For those who heard that, our interview, well, technical difficulties happened. Skype ate it. The computer hates us. Microsoft, I don't know. Someone hates us. And the rest of the interview died a terrible death that sounded almost like R2-D2, but nowhere near as cool.